The 2005 Mighty Mouse is frequently cited as one of Apple's worst designs. Yet, the same year this mouse arrived, Apple was using it to test the specific sensor and haptic technologies that would eventually define their entire hardware ecosystem. To understand why this mouse had to exist, you have to look back to 1984. When the Macintosh launched, Apple established a hardware rule that would hold for 21 years. The mouse would have exactly one button. At the time, computers were intimidating. A single button meant the user never had to guess which side to click. It was a philosophy centered on keeping the cognitive load as low as possible for the average consumer. For 2 decades, Apple prioritized this visual and operational simplicity over the added functionality found on PCs. But by the mid-2000s, software was getting more complex. With the arrival of Mac OS X, navigating features like Exposé or context menus with a single click was becoming a functional bottleneck. This coincided with the iPod halo effect. Apple was suddenly pulling in a massive wave of lifelong Windows users who were trading in their PCs for Macs. These switchers expected the speed of a 2-button mouse and a scroll wheel. To them, the standard Apple mouse felt like an archaic limitation. Inside Apple, there was a deadlock. The design team refused to build a multi-button device that looked like a cluttered peripheral. They were committed to a seamless, minimalist aesthetic. Apple needed to satisfy the market, but weren't willing to add physical buttons. They had to hide that complexity inside the shell. The solution arrived in August 2005. The Mighty Mouse looked like a museum piece, a solid white dome that appeared to have no buttons. Instead of physical switches, Apple used hidden capacitive touch sensors embedded beneath the plastic. These tracked finger placement to determine which side was pressed. In the center, a tiny rubber ball used miniature internal rollers to track movement in 360 degrees, allowing for diagonal scrolling. Since the shell didn't have the mechanical throw of a real button, Apple built in a tiny electronic speaker. It played a recorded clicking sound to give the user a sense of tactile feedback. The Mighty Mouse was essentially a digital simulation of a mechanical tool, using software and sensors to maintain the look of a single piece of plastic. Compared to the utilitarian mice of the day, Apple's design was striking, but the decision to hide the mechanics created immediate functional problems. Because the shell pivoted on one mechanism, sensors interpreted intent. If your left finger touched the shell during a right click, it registered a primary click. You had to lift your index finger entirely off the surface, a requirement working against years of established muscle memory. Then there was the scroll ball. Its small size made it highly susceptible to clogging. Skin oils and dust would jam the internal rollers, eventually stopping the ball from scrolling in certain directions. Even the force-sensing side buttons were a struggle. They required so much pressure to activate that users often inadvertently pushed the entire mouse across the desk while trying to click. Technology critics were quick to point out these shortcomings. Walt Mossberg, among others, argued that Apple had prioritized a sleek silhouette over basic usability. In trying to protect their minimalist aesthetic with invisible buttons, Apple had compromised the physical reliability of the device. Today, the Mighty Mouse is a frequent entry on lists of Apple's biggest failures. Swedish tech journals at the time summarized it as a product with trista brista, or sad flaws. But from a developmental standpoint, this failure was a necessary step. It acted as a bridge between the mechanical era and what came next. The constant jamming of the scroll ball proved to Apple that mechanical miniaturization was a dead end for high-traffic peripherals. This lesson led directly to the Magic Mouse, which replaced the vulnerable rubber ball with a solid-state multi-touch surface. The tiny internal speaker used for synthetic feedback was also a precursor. It established the concept of using artificial haptics to replace physical motion, a feature that eventually became standard in Mac trackpads. Apple took these experiments with capacitive touch and artificial feedback and applied them to a much larger project. By 2007, these same principles were being used to build the interface for the original iPhone. The Mighty Mouse was a frustrating, awkward peripheral, but its internal experiments provided the friction Apple needed to shift their hardware away from mechanical buttons and toward the gestural touch interfaces we use today.